Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacy Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 260. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, stacyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Nancy Bernhard about her debut novel, The Double Standard Sporting House. Set in New York City in 1868 during the reign of the Tammany Hall crime syndicate, this book centers around an elite brothel run by a woman known as Doc, who uses the business as a secret way to fund her free clinic for women. Doc, herself a skilled nurse, found freedom in giving up the societal pressure to be respectable. That freedom brings with it wealth and power for herself and the girls who work in her brothel. Nancy's research into the history of sex work in New York City during this time period revealed some startling statistics regarding the numbers of women engaged in such work and their reasons for doing so, as well as the percentage of men partaking in it. In this episode, I'll chat with Nancy about her writing journey, how the inspiration for the story came from one of her great aunts, and why she says medicine was like the Wild West during this time period, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Nancy Bernhard, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your new debut novel, The Double Standard Sporting House. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Sure. So a sporting house is a brothel, and it's about a woman who owns an elite brothel in 1868 New York City as a way to fund her free clinic for women. It's a very unusual combination of things. And I'll back up and explain how I started getting into this, how I started researching the history of the sex trade in New York. When I was a teenager, my very flamboyant, hilarious, barrel of laughs grandmother, who had been a flapper in 1920s New York City, confidingly told me that her Aunt Beatty, my great-grandmother was one of 7 siblings. So my grandmother's Aunt Beatty was a madam. And I didn't, I was a teenager. I didn't know what to say. I blinked and I probably changed the subject. But I wondered a lot over a long period of time, how does a middle-class girl with a very big supportive family end up in this position, in the sex trade? And I got a doctorate in American history, but I was looking more at politics, and it just kind of nagged at me. Periodically, I would wonder about it, and I would think about this great Aunt Beatty of mine and wonder about her. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, I was digitizing some old family photos. I ended up with all the really old photos, the 19th and early 20th century photos. I was digitizing them, and I ran across this spectacular photograph of Beatty and 6 of her 7 siblings. And I finally thought to ask my father, who was then 87. And I said, so Beatty, was she a madam? And he just about bust a gut laughing. We were on Zoom, and he thought that was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. He said, she wasn't a madam. She lived with a man on the Upper West Side of New York City whose wife had long been institutionalized. She was incapacitated in some way. And he and Beatty lived together, and when his wife passed, they got married, and they were together for 50 years or something. But my grandmother sort of perpetuated what we now call slut shaming, right? Any woman who's not married and monogamous is somehow a sex worker. And my grandmother was such an exaggerator that she promoted her to madam, right? So that's why my father thought it was so funny. And then it turned out that my grandmother had told my brother a totally different story, which is probably closer to the truth, which is that far from being scandalized by my aunt's unusual living arrangements, she used to spend the night at her apartment in New York because it saved her the trouble of getting home on the train after a night of partying. And I thought, oh, great. So she tells my brother the juicy story. I wish I'd been able to ask her, so what were you getting up to? And it turned out that Beatty herself had indeed had a wild adventure. At age 18, she ran off to Argentina with a tango dancer and got married. And I was like, oh man, I wish I had heard these stories from these women, but they were so constrained by having to maintain the image of respectability that they never would have said any of these things out loud. So that spoke to me about the ways that women are shamed for being sexual creatures, right? Men are forgiven and indulged, and women bear the tremendous burden of reproduction, but also are shamed for it. And heaven forbid they want to have any fun. So I get this story about Beatty. It's the beginning of the pandemic. I'm facing the first winter of the lockdown at home, and I really thought, oh, I need a project. I need something that I'm going to really dig my teeth into. So I started reading about the history of sex work in New York, and very quickly discovered the role of Tammany Hall, this very corrupt political syndicate in the 19th century, and how they controlled the vice industries. And there was a one sort of throwaway line, a half a line in a book about the history of prostitution that said this trade had been largely controlled by women until about 1870, when Tammany came in and started taking it over. And I never really found any historical sources that described that takeover or what actually happened, but we have to imagine that it was trafficking, there was more violence, more use of pimps. Like, when men take over the sex trade from women, it becomes harsher for the most part. Not always. There are certainly some harsh women in this business. So my original question, how does a girl with resources, a girl with skills, with support end up in this business? And the first thing that I discovered when I started reading was that by far the answer to the question of how any girl ends up in the sex trade is poverty. Women were excluded from most professions. You couldn't make any money, any good money, doing anything. Most women were working as domestics or needle workers, didn't pay a living wage. And this statistic just blew me away. 30% of women in mid-century New York did sex work at some point in their lives just to make ends meet. Didn't mean 30% of women at any given time, but 30% of women at that time over the course of their life had done it. So the overwhelming answer to the question is poverty. For a middle-class girl, the overwhelming answer is different. And sadly, the answer is rape, assault, kidnapping. Sometimes it's seduction, which, are really kind of mean-spirited, deliberate, deceptive kind of seduction, to convince a girl that she's consenting, and then she's quickly abandoned. And because of the shame of this kind of thing, girls often couldn't go home, right? You couldn't go home again after you've run off with somebody or you've been sullied, so-called sullied in this way. So that's a very long introduction to saying I wanted to turn this whole story on its head and I started imagining a girl who really was very capable, who ends up in this situation by no fault of her own. She's incredibly skilled in medicine. She can't be a doctor. There's the women who've been able to go to medical school at that point in time, you could count on your fingers. She's incredibly mistreated as a nurse. Her skill is not recognized, or nobody cares that she's more skilled than many of the doctors that she's working with. And she ends up on the wrong side of this divide and discovers just so much more freedom to practice medicine and live her life the way she wants to, having given up the need to be respectable. On the other side of this divide, there's this whole world of freedom and independence and also wealth if you're willing to engage in this way. So she runs this house. Girls have to choose it, right? It's a she does her very best to protect them, to keep them healthy, to choose clients who are not going to be abusive. And they make a boatload of money doing it. And the richest men, the most powerful men in the city are their intimate friends. So they exert all this influence. And when Tammany comes in and really starts to mess things up for so many girls and women, they're in a position to fight back. And so the central plot of the book is pitting what these women know about compassion and healing and community and human development and human character against the traditional masculine strengths in violence and domination and power, that different kind of power. So that's a very long answer to the question of how this book came about.
Well, that's good. I was going to ask you about setting for the book to kind of set the scene and what we were looking at.
Mm-hmm.
In this way, as part of sort of setting and characters, you include some real world, real life historical figures, real world places and events. Can you walk us through some of those? Because then I want to talk about the line between sort of the history and fiction and historical fiction. But can you help us understand the real world, the historical part of this novel? Right.
Sure. So Tammany, of course, is real. It was the very apex. 1868 to 1872 is the very apex of the power of the Tweed Ring. So Boss Bill Tweed only appears obliquely, but one of his chief lieutenants, Peter Sweeney, is a real character, is a real historical personage. He is the comptroller of the city of New York, and he's the genius behind the epic skimming of city contracts and awarding of city contracts to their friends. And it really is a stupendous crime that these people commit against the city of New York. It's a period of tremendous growth. Huge Irish immigration had preceded it. So the city over the course of 1850 to 1880 doubles in population. There's a huge housing shortage. There's a tremendous need for building and for jobs for these people who have arrived with nothing. And the old leadership, the aristocrats who formerly had run New York, had no interest in dealing with this problem. So Tammany had been a political club, and it became the machine of the Democratic Party, the party of the working men in the city, and they took it on. And it in exchange for loyalty and votes from all these immigrants, they provided patronage jobs and something resembling very rudimentary social services for all these people. Sweeney himself is really interesting. It's clear to me from the few personal details that we have in records of him that he was neurodivergent. He was not really able to converse or socialize in the way that he was expected to. He was a lawyer. He was appointed a district attorney. The very first time he tried to argue a case, he completely lost it and couldn't do it. But he was brilliant. And to me, it sounded very much like someone, what we now say, on the spectrum. He had some incredible strengths and some incredible weaknesses. So I really enjoyed writing that character for this historical person. So that's certainly real. Sources on elite prostitution, elite sex trade in New York are harder to find. We know a few things. We have like gentlemen's guides to New York, like little pocket guides that men would have had, and it lists who the owners were and how many girls were there and what their charms were and how the house was decorated and things like that. When a crime would be committed, a very famous financier, Diamond Jim Fisk, was gunned down by the current lover of his former lover, Josie Mansfield, who was an elite sex worker. So we know a little bit about Josie, but we don't have any direct primary sources from any of these women. So that, like, creating the house for me was really fun because I could imagine all these empowered women who came there for 100 different reasons. And Doc creates this little community that is really intended to foster independence, to allow women to lead the lives they want to lead instead of ones that they've been trapped into or forced into. So that was a lot of fun. That is, I say it's a little bit of a feminist fantasy, but it's completely plausible that this is how that would have gone. The other thing, and on the cover of the book, we see Lydia Thompson and the Blonde Bells of Burlesque, which is a real burlesque troupe, the biggest craze to hit New York in a decade in the 1860s. And of course, women in theater were basically considered sex workers because you're on the stage and showing yourself off. And burlesque at that time, it was not stripping, which it became later. It was satire. They used a little bit of leg, right? They would wear heavy cotton tights and, and skirts to like mid-thigh. Now, something we would consider very tame now. And that would lure all these men into the theater. But they were lampooning male predatory behavior. Actually, the big show that debuted in the fall of 1868 was called Ixion, and Ixion himself is a Greco-Roman story, a king of Thessaly who was a total rogue, a total libertine, and kind of a buffoon. So it was possible to make fun of this behavior. I don't think it really changed very much in the ways that men behaved or women were treated, but the burlesque craze was absolutely real. And Lydia Thompson appears as a minor character in the book, and that was a lot of fun to do. There are a couple of characters that are more loosely based on real people. The character Asa Vanderpool in the novel is based loosely on a newspaper editor who worked for Lincoln and the Secretary of War, Charles Dana. Loosely based on Charles Dana, who ran the Sun, the most widely read newspaper in New York in this period. He had formerly worked for the Herald, and he left the Herald because the editor of the Herald wasn't pro-union enough. Charles Dana was very pro-emancipation. So he went to work for Lincoln and the Secretary of War, riding around Southern battlefields and sending information back to Washington. And the generals at first distrusted him as a spy, but then they realized he was really on the right page with them. And Doc meets and treats this character who's having some trauma, which she is very experienced at treating because of who her patients are. And that's a whole other thread of the book. So those are a few of the real people. There are some others, but there are a few more. So yeah, so you were asking about where the history ends and where the fiction begins. And as a historian, my rule of thumb was if I could find a source, if I could find something that was true or documented, because those two things are not the same. If I could find something that was documented, I respected it. And beyond that cliff, I felt free to make it up.
That's fair. It's a good line to draw.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the title, because you mentioned briefly that a sporting house was used as a reference for a brothel.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you land on the title, and at what point did the title come to you?
It came pretty early.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think a sporting house is such a lovely euphemism. A sport. It started out because a man. This is, the 19th century is when commercial culture really starts to burgeon worldwide, and it actually started in England. And a sport would be somebody who would go to a boxing match or a horse race, right? Someone who was out and about on the town in these sort of racy ways. We see it as mild, but sort of racy ways. And very quickly, it became equated with also frequenting prostitutes, right? Participating in the sex trade. So the best estimates are the percentage of men who did become clients in the sex trade in mid-19th century New York was 50%. Not all the time, but at least once in their life. And there were many it was their routine way of life. So a sporting man is someone who's going to boxing matches. There was a charming kind of institution in New York at this time called a concert saloon. So it was a place where men could go to be entertained. There might be boxing matches. There might be kind of vaudeville style acts, minstrel show acts, a little bit of burlesque, singers, dancers, jugglers, and very few women would be frequenting the concert saloons. But women, young women were the waitresses. They were called waiter girls, and they wore these characteristic red boots. And many of them would go upstairs, with a fee for a fee, but many of them wouldn't. And they tended to be teenagers. They were young. So this is the sporting culture of New York. It's very widespread, and there was a huge range of prices and levels, right? So there was streetwalkers, very miserable kind of existence, just eking out the most basic living, all the way up to an elite courtesan, someone who's extremely well paid, living a very elegant life, very well educated, and everything in between. So, so I love the sporting house idea. And then, of course, the the double standard for sexual behavior is overwhelming. It still exists, right? It's still very much in force, right? Men are forgiven even when they're at the highest levels of power and trafficking in teenagers, children, right? Men are forgiven, they get away with it, and women are shamed. They are blamed for it. It's their fault, and they, suffer terrible consequences for it. So there was a moment when I was thinking about the double standard. I started collecting expressions of the double standard, like from period things, and I was working on that, and the title came to me, and I started cracking up. I thought it was hilarious. I don't know if anybody else thinks that's hilarious, but at the moment that I thought of it, I was like, oh, there's the title of the book.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it sounds like you had to do an amazing amount of research for
hmm
this. And based on some of the things you've already said, I can imagine that there were some surprises for you as you were researching this, things that you didn't know before you got started, including your family history, which was what
Right.
sparked the whole thing.
Right.
So I'm curious, what other surprises there were for you, and what do you think we today get wrong about that time period?
hmm Well, one thing that was surprising to me is when you look at women's reproductive health care at that time, the mechanism of human fertility was not understood. Medicine did not know when or how a woman got pregnant. So my conjecture was that Doc knew, and certainly brothel nurses, we have almost no documentation on brothel nurses, even though they existed, brothel doctors existed. Um, I bet they knew, right?
Yeah,
This is what they do all day long,
right, right.
right? And poor women had almost no access to healthcare. It would have been, midwives, healers, sort of street medicine. If you look at newspapers, there are advertisements for all kinds of both patent medicines, which are hoaxes, but also the herbs that would prevent pregnancy or the herbs that would end a pregnancy, ads for abortionists that are cloaked in interesting language in the newspaper. Medicine was the Wild West. It's just beginning to resemble the kind of standardized training, education, licensure that we understand now. But women were excluded from that. There was something called eclectic medical schools where women could become doctors, but it was very proper. So they weren't actually allowed to do procedures or put their hands on anybody. Blood and guts was not coming into eclectic medicine. It was herbs. So I thought, wow, there was so much going on that we have no idea because it was beyond this pale of respectability or anything that anybody would say out loud. And the imbalances and attacks on women's healthcare continue. Right? This is nothing new. So you had asked about surprises, and then I forgot what you asked
Oh, what
about
we tend to
specifically.
get wrong,
What we tend to get wrong.
yeah.
Right. So I think there's a maybe changing, but basic conception that a woman who works in the sex trade is morally reprehensible, morally suspect. She's a floozy. She's lazy. She's oversexed. And all of that is just so completely wrong. There were a few women who made a calculation that this was going to be a better life from them than the alternative. But almost always it was either desperation from poverty or that they've been forced and they can't go back. So, you know, now that women have access to all kinds of employment, the number of women who work in the sex trade in the US right now is about 1%. So contrast that to 30% because of what women's opportunities were at that time. And I think that's pretty, I think we get that pretty wrong.
Right, right. No, shocking.
Yeah.
I'm sure most people have no idea
Right.
that those are the numbers.
Right. Sex trade is a really good prism into the ways that sex and reproduction are organized in our society, much to women's detriment and into women's economic dependency.
Yeah, yeah. So now that you've tackled this topic, which it's a big topic. It's a lot of research. It's a lot of information to wrestle into one story, right? Like one character's plot line, basically.
Thank you for noticing.
But any chance there's going to be more stories in this realm? Where do you go from here?
I have two other projects that are cooking that are not sequels or anything in this world, but I wouldn't rule it out. I think Vivi is a really interesting character, and what happens to her after the end of the double standard might be interesting. I might not be done with Doc, but I have a couple of other things that are going to have to happen first.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
More fiction? More? Do you think
Yeah.
you'll do this again? Okay, good.
Mhm.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, in the meantime, while you were working on those,
Mhm.
where can people go to find you and more information about the book and what you have going on?
So I have a website. It's my name, nancybernhard.com. And there's some information there about the real people that appear in the double standard, and some basic information about the sex trade in the 19th century in New York. You can find me on all the socials. And there are links to that on the website. And and the book, there's links to buy the book there, but also any place that you buy books, you'll be able to find it.
Good, good. Well, Nancy, I want to thank you for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with the Double Standard Sporting House and the works in progress. We will look forward to those. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far. Best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much, Stacey. I really appreciate it.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.